you all for being here. And thank you, David, for opening up this amazing bookstore and being so encouraging and supportive. I had always, as a I guess as a young adult, maybe even younger than that, kind of fantasized about being in the company of these people, these books, some of these great writers, and dreaming about having my own book or two up there. So it's really cool to be surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses here, and in their company. It's a real honor, it really is. And it's an honor that you all chose to come out tonight to hear about this book that I've put together. So it originated back in about 1993 when John and I were undergraduates at Wake Forest University. We had, I've written about this before, so I apologize if this is redundant, but we both kind of fell for the same woman at the same time. In a graduate course we took together on Karl Barth, who's a Protestant, very prominent Protestant theologian from the last century, and Flannery O'Connor, who I probably don't need to tell anybody in this room who she is. But growing up, we both went to the same high school and had never heard of Flannery O'Connor, even though we were in Atlanta. You know, O'Connor was the most famous writer to come from Georgia, apart from maybe Margaret Mitchell, who's famous for different reasons. But anyway, we were, if you haven't read O'Connor, buy her books instead of mine and read them first, and you'll be much more richly rewarded. But she has this really eccentric view of the world and of the South, and she had just this side of Southern life that was completely out of left field for me, and I think John's experience, we could talk maybe more about this. But anyway, we got this idea like several years later after we had both been in graduate school a little bit to go, let's just explore the South that we had started to read about in O'Connor and see, and by the way, and I talk about this in the introduction to this book, the essay, starts with Atlanta in the mid-1990s, which was rapidly changing. A lot of what was good or what was old about Atlanta was disappearing or getting paved over or leveled. Atlanta has a particular fondness for demolition, and anyway, so we were set out on the road to see if this South still there? Is the type of world that O'Connor was writing about, does that even exist? Did it ever exist? Is this kind of weird, quirky, theologically rich region still out there? And we found more than we were looking for, I think. And we did 5 trips together up until 2004. You know, we both had careers and lives and all of this. So we took a big pause, and then in 2018 we had the opportunity to go back on the road, and it was one of those scenarios where it was like irresistible. We had to go do this. The culture had shifted dramatically in the intervening decade and a half. There were questions on this was 2018, so it was 2 years after Charleston. You know, it was this period where the subject of white supremacy and race and how embedded it is in the history of our nation, and how inextricably bound white supremacy, racism, and the story of America are. This was all on the table. So when we went back, I think we started to see things about the region that we hadn't noticed before, or maybe didn't have the eyes to see so much. And for me in particular, what I also began to see was the way my own family's history was bound up in this story too. And a family on my dad's side that's really has a pretty deep history in Atlanta, is pretty closely connected to sort of the post-Civil War story, the New South kind of story of Atlanta. I guess all of Atlanta's story is really New South. But anyway, I started to discover things that, not just about the region, but about my own personal history that I could not believe I'd never heard. That could be like the sort of one sentence summary of all of this work is like, I can't believe I never knew this. I'll give you one kind of amusing example of the regime of forgetfulness that has overtaken Southern. I don't want to generalize too much, but just that I began to see reflected in some of the places that John and I have been, and in my own family history, and how deep the kind of the psychological effort of suppressing memory really went. My great-great-grandfather was a Supreme Court justice for the state of Georgia around the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. He then became basically one of the chief lawyers for the Coca-Cola company after that. But when I was doing research for the second part of this book, by the way, is a longer kind of narrative book that's coming out later this year called Prologue to the South, where I go into more detail about this, less visual but more narrative. And one of the things I encountered about him was a story from the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, little paragraph from 1883. It's talking about John Slaughter Candler was his name. And these little pieces were appearing in national newspapers about how this promising young lawyer from Decatur had an accident stepping off a train platform, and he was a goner. He cut off his legs, and he was done for. He was going to die. I mean, these were written like, it's really sad, he's done. And, well, he didn't die. He survived, and the Savannah Morning News went to interview him a couple weeks later, and they asked him, like, what do you attribute your recovery to? And he said, well, two things. I never smoke or drink, and I never, and I would have gotten better faster if I didn't say the word darn so much. So, Methodist family, very teetotally Methodist family. Anyway, so basically what happened is he's stepping off the train. He fell, and the train, as far as I can surmise, ran over his feet and basically amputated both feet. Now, I have seen pictures of this person standing on two legs, and he didn't have any feet. Like, how does that not make the dinner table conversation? Ever. That's a cool story. I mean, I don't know if cool is the right word. It's an interesting story. And anyway, so, but that's just indicative of how much kind of psychological labor was put into, at least my family's story, and sort of leaving out certain details. That's an amusing one. There are many others that aren't as amusing and that are pretty disturbing, that also more understandably got sort of left out from the family dinner table conversation. Anyway, the book includes images from 25 years of road tripping together. And there are three that are in front of you, and I thought I would just talk about these very briefly, and then we can have more of a conversation about them. I think these came from two separate tours. Two of them are from 2018, and one of them is from 2019. The one on the I mentioned this in the book. It's in lieu of, you can read it later. But basically, this is. Does anyone recognize what this is?
That's Money, Mississippi.
It is. It's Money, and this is Bryant's grocery store in Money, which is the notorious building where Emmett Till, in late August 1955, allegedly had this encounter with Carolyn Bryant, which was the thing that led to his lynching shortly thereafter. It's a notorious structure, and it's decaying. The family that owns, this is wild, but the family who owns this building, Bryant's Grocery, is basically letting it fall apart unless someone is willing to buy the property from them. And the current asking price is $40 million. The guy who owned the patriarch of this family was a foreman on the jury that acquitted J.W. Milam and Roy Bryant of Emmett Till's murder in 1955. This is how weird all this stuff gets. Talk about connections. The family also owns a gas station. I don't have a photograph of this. A gas station. Like, if Bryant's Grocery is there's a gas station right here. It's like an old Esso station. And it looks like something you'd see in American Graffiti or something. It's like a old 1950s gas station with a pump out front and a sign and all this stuff, and it's meant to it looks like it's designed to evoke nostalgia for the same period, oddly enough, that for the 1950s, the same decade in which Emmett Till was brutally murdered. Anyway, the same family owns these two buildings. So for me, this is like the juxtaposition of these two buildings right next to each other was a very powerful illustration of the way in which Southern memory and American memory, for me, they're not different. It's just that in the South, it's more dramatic and more sort of intensified maybe than any other region in the country. But these are two alternative ways of remembering history. One is basically let it collapse into the ground and die of its own old age and hope that people will forget about it, or turn it into a museum piece. And so you can, this is one of the things we're going through as a culture right now, is trying to figure out, we've done this sort of prettying up history for a long time. And the shine has worn off, and the reality of our own history looks a lot more like this than it does the pretty gas station. I don't know. I haven't been back to Money in a couple years. I'm not even sure if that wall is still there. It's in very bad repair. This is from the front of the building would be here. This is from one side, and it's surrounded by barbed wire. The one in the middle, this is a playground in Menlo, Georgia, which is in the northwest part of the state, the mountainous region. And there's a Confederate monument in the middle of this playground. And it was designed that way, it was bequeathed to the city of Menlo by, I forget the person's name, it's in the notes, that this would be for the enjoyment of children in perpetuity. So there's this swing set right in front of a Confederate monument, which is another kind of just bizarre juxtaposition. The one on the right is the cover of the book, which looks like this. And this was taken inside Hill House on the Andalusia property in Milledgeville, not far from here, which was the home of Flannery O'Connor and her mother Regina, where she lived for the last 13 years of her life and wrote most of her work there. This house was recently restored just before we got there in 2018, actually. It dates from about the 1850s, and it was the home for an African-American couple who lived on the property and worked the farm. And so their story is only now kind of beginning to be sort of recovered and retold. You know, O'Connor Flannery gets all of the attention for obvious reasons at Andalusia, but there are these other stories there that are now being sort of recovered as well. Those are just 3 images that are from the book that I think kind of get at what this project has been about, and the for me, doing shooting these images in film was an intentional decision John and I both made. I mean, we started shooting film. There was no digital photography in 1997. So when we came back in 2018, we deliberately wanted to shoot film because of the way it forces you to slow down. It forces you to stop and really calculate. Calculate may not be the right word, but slow down certainly and pay attention. And also, I think film reveals things later that you might not have noticed the first time around, which for me was basically consistent with the ethos of this whole project, which was kind of going back and seeing aspects of our history that I can't believe I never learned about. Okay, I don't know if that was probably way too much.
So I want to ask about the idea of the road, and just a little bit of background. So on the very first trip in 1997, I had a 1977 Ford F-150 truck without air conditioning.
It had air conditioning? You roll the windows down?
Well, yeah, it had those little triangle windows. You could flip around the other way. It actually worked really well as long as you were moving. Of course, it didn't dehumidify the cab. But we deliberately went out in that as we hit the road. We went and just there was no filter between us and the climate, the heat and the humidity. But on the very first trip, we established this pattern of we didn't take any interstates, and ideally we took just sort of 2-lane roads, so older U.S. highways or just country roads, and that was typically the pattern. Here and there, to make up for time, we've occasionally hopped on an interstate, but we want to get off the beaten path and just see where kind of the road took us. And that's how we've continued to do the trip. So just thinking about how you travel and roads. Why does the route matter? What does traveling in this manner do?
Well, I think I try to describe it in this book as a kind of spiritual exercise because of the way it requires a certain kind of openness and indeterminacy, a lack of certainty, that all of which kind of run upstream of the ideals our culture, I think, tends to privilege, which is knowing what you're doing, having a plan. I'm not against having a plan, just not very good at it. And the sort of openness that not really having an idea of where you're going that requires of you can actually be kind of freeing, I think. I mean, I found it to be relevant to other, the cultivation of other mental habits or spiritual habits or whatever that I think have been beneficial, or at least I'm still learning how to put those into practice. But if the subject is the South and American history, it's especially advantageous to not really have a map beforehand, because it's the most mythologized region of the United States. It's the area everybody thinks they understand or have an idea about. I mean, all you have to do is watch any movie made in Hollywood and set in the South, and I guarantee you, most people in this room, if you're from here or from the South or have lived here long enough, you're going to find it frustrating because there's going to be some aspect of it. The great movie called Knives Out. Have y'all seen that? It's a wonderful film, but Daniel Craig, whom I love, I don't know if this is intentional, but he creates this accent that for his character that I think is supposed to be a Southern accent.
New Orleans.
But it doesn't sound like any Louisiana.
It's supposed to be.
It's supposed to be. But
Terrible.
so you had the same reaction. You're
Yes.
like,
It's
so
Foghorn Leghorn.
it's
Yeah, it is.
which is probably more accurate. Foghorn Leghorn is more accurate. Anyway, so I think in the sense of unforgetting or unlearning the sort of deeply ingrained ideas we think we have about America, about this region, and then about ourselves. I feel like personally, I think that's the metaphor of the road. It struck me not just as a metaphor, but as I began to think about it, it's something everybody uses almost every day. Maybe not everybody, but it's like an ancient form of technology that no one, or at least I never really think about. But it's a metaphor that goes all the way back to Greek philosophy, the origins of Greek philosophy, and then later in Christian theology, use this image of the road as pretty central. So anyway, I think there are lots of reasons. The other thing is it's just fun. I mean, it's more fun to really not. If you can deal with it, some people don't like to travel without an itinerary. But if you're okay with that, then I think it can really be enjoyable.
Yeah. So I want to ask a question about unforgetting, and at least on the face of it, it seems like the South would be the place where like the past is most visibly or most palpably present. Right, old times there are not forgotten. But you speak of unforgetting as this kind of active work that needs to be done, and I'm curious, in the 25 years since the first trip, is there more forgetting going on in the South? Is there less forgetting? Is there more honest wrestling with the region's past?
Man, I'm going to not answer that question because for a second while I try to think. I'm going to buy time by noticing just above your head there's a fantastic book on the shelf called Hard Religion. You should buy that book too.
It's a wonderful
John.
children's book. Yeah.
It's a great So if let's take historical markers just as a metric for how well we're doing culturally in terms of remembering our past. I think in some senses there's been a real improvement there. I was driving from Asheville to Greenville, South Carolina, and right near Furman University campus there's a new marker to a lynching that happened there in like 1898. There's one in Pack Square in Asheville. Like the work, and that's mostly through the work of the Equal Justice Initiative and in Montgomery, who's been behind the lynching memorial and the Legacy Museum there, which are both incredible. You should make a point of going to visit those. So, yeah, in one sense, like it's good that we have more visible signs that are more honest about our past, which is not yet the kind of the internal work that that we sort of need to do collectively and personally. That part is a lot harder. I sometimes think naming streets after people is a great way of recognizing them, but it's also a way of ensuring that they never are talked about. So there's this weird sort of paradox that it's not enough just to put the monuments or put the historical markers up, although I think that's extremely important, and I'm always on the lookout. I mean, we've joked about driving together and there's like a historical marker, like slam on the brakes, and it's like something completely
Bland.
But
Yeah.
Stoneman's Raid. There are like 50 markers to Stoneman's Raids around the South, or like anyway, the Rutherford Trace or something like that. So I think that's all good, but I don't know. I mean, as I'm looking around the shelves of this beautiful bookstore and seeing how many books there are on this subject right now. There's one I'm looking at, We Refuse to Forget. I mean, I think that there's a book on Ida B. Wells. I mean, I think there's so much more of this history is getting attention now, and I think that's wonderful. I just wish I had time to read all of all of them. So, yes and no. I think it's culturally there's more on the table, but I don't know that I could really answer how we're doing at internalizing that.